The planet Theloria drifted in the black void like a scarred and forgotten relic. Its surface was a graveyard of metal and ash, a silent witness to a war that had ended a decade ago. Once a bustling hub for the Zenter, a technologically advanced alien species, it was now an empty shell, a testament to their abrupt retreat after losing their hold on the sector. The air was thin and biting, swirling with toxic dust that caught the red light of the dying sun. Captain Aria Lennox stood at the helm of her battered starship, the Dauntless, staring at the desolate landscape that stretched out beneath her. She leaned forward, adjusting her ship's scanners, trying to filter through the electromagnetic interference that clouded the atmosphere. It was no easy task. Theloria was notorious for its unstable magnetic fields, remnants of the ancient terraforming gone wrong. Aria wasn't here for sightseeing. A seasoned scavenger, she thrived on the abandoned remnants of the Zenter's war-torn worlds, eking out a living from whatever scraps she could find. Today, she was chasing a faint signal that her ship's sensors had picked up, a signature hinting at residual power in one of the old Zenter research compounds. If she was lucky, it could be a treasure trove of forgotten technology. "All right, Dauntless," she muttered to herself, tightening her gloves and checking her plasma pistol holstered at her side. "Let's see if this old rock still has something worth taking." With a hiss of hydraulics, the ship's landing gears touched down on the cracked, frozen ground. Dust swirled around her as she descended the ramp, her boots crunching on the brittle surface. The atmosphere was just breathable enough not to need a helmet, though the acrid air stung her lungs. She adjusted the breathing filter strapped to her face and made her way toward the derelict facility looming on the horizon. The compound was a hulking structure, half buried in sand and rock. Its once sleek metal walls were pitted with scars from the conflict, and twisted shards of metal jutted out like broken bones. As Aria approached, she activated her wrist scanner, searching for an entrance that hadn't been welded shut or collapsed under the weight of time. Come on," she muttered, running her fingers over the cracked surface. Finally, she found what she was looking for, a partially hidden access panel. With a few deft taps on her datapad, the door creaked open, releasing a burst of stale, icy air. The inside was as lifeless as the outside, filled with shattered consoles and overturned equipment. Red emergency lights flickered sporadically, casting eerie shadows that danced along the walls. Aria's boots echoed as she ventured deeper, the only sound in the oppressive silence. The deeper she went, the more she felt the oppressive weight of the structure pressing in on her, like it was a tomb waiting to swallow her whole. But there it was again, that faint signal. It pulsed in her earpiece like a heartbeat, leading her down twisting corridors. She could tell from the layout that this was no ordinary research facility. It was more like a containment center, with reinforced walls and blast doors that could withstand an internal explosion. "What the hell were you experimenting on in here?" she wondered aloud, her voice swallowed by the darkness. At last, she reached the source of the signal, a heavy, sealed door marked with Zenter glyphs that glowed faintly. She placed her hand on a scanner pad beside the door, hoping the old code she had hacked from the Zenter archives would still work. To her relief, the door groaned open, revealing a chamber bathed in a sickly green light. The sight that met her eyes froze her in place. The room was filled with twisted machinery, biotubes, and containment units that had long since been smashed open. In the center of it all lay a massive, wolf-like creature, its fur shimmering with an otherworldly sheen. Its eyes, a deep, unnatural blue, flickered weakly as it lifted its head to look at her. Aria's breath caught in her throat. The creature was unlike anything she had ever seen. Its fur seemed to ripple like liquid metal, and faint lines of circuitry were visible beneath its skin. Despite its obvious injuries, deep gashes that exposed glowing tissue and exposed wiring, it still exuded a terrifying, majestic presence. But what caught her attention even more were the three small shapes nestled against the creature's side. Cub-like creatures, each no larger than a medium-sized dog, with the same iridescent fur and glowing eyes. They were huddled together, their bodies trembling. The mother wolf let out a low, pained growl as Aria stepped closer, but she lacked the strength to rise. Arya's instincts screamed at her to leave. She had heard enough horror stories of Zenter bioweapons that could tear a person apart in seconds. Yet, as she stared at the dying mother and her cubs, she couldn't ignore the hollow feeling gnawing at her gut. "Damn it," she muttered under her breath. She knew she should turn and walk away. Taking a Zenter experiment on board her ship was a risk beyond reason, especially one that looked as dangerous as this. But the cubs' tiny whimpers, the way they pressed closer to their wounded mother, stirred something in her. Kneeling down slowly, she reached into her pack for a vial of biogel, a versatile healing agent she had scavenged from another abandoned Zenter base. The mother wolf's eyes narrowed, her growl deepening, but Arya held up her hands in a gesture of peace. "I'm trying to help," she said softly, inching closer. The wolf's gaze softened, just for a moment. Arya took her chance, carefully applying the gel to the worst of the wounds. To her amazement, the gel began to react, sealing the torn flesh and reconnecting the exposed circuits. "There," Arya whispered, her voice barely audible. "That should buy you some time." The mother wolf's eyes flickered, and she let out a soft, almost grateful sound. The cubs, now curious, crept closer to Arya, sniffing her hands. Despite their unnerving, glowing eyes, they looked more like frightened animals than bioengineered monsters. But just as she started to relax, her earpiece crackled to life with an urgent warning. Her ship's sensors had detected multiple vessels entering the atmosphere. Zenter ships. "Damn it!" Arya cursed. They must have picked up her signal. With no time to think, she turned back to the wounded creatures. "I'm getting you out of here," she said firmly, scooping up two of the cubs. The third clung to its mother, refusing to let go. Arya cursed again, but quickly reached for her communicator. Dauntless, prep for emergency departure, she commanded, her heart pounding. As she hefted the weakened mother wolf over her shoulder, the cubs let out panicked cries. The storm outside was picking up, the air filled with the distant roar of Zenter engines. Arya sprinted through the dark corridors, her mind racing. She had come here looking for salvage, but ended up with something far more dangerous and precious. If she could get them off this cursed planet alive, she knew she was signing up for a world of trouble. But for reasons she couldn't fully understand, she just couldn't leave them behind. Arya's heart pounded as she sprinted through the labyrinthine corridors of the abandoned facility, the weight of the wounded wolf heavy on her back. Behind her, the cubs darted on unsteady legs, their glowing blue eyes wide with fear. The howling winds of the Loria battered the structure, masking the distant rumble of approaching engines. The Zenter were closing in, and Arya knew they wouldn't take kindly to her stealing their bioengineered property. "Come on, you stubborn thing, hold on," she grunted, adjusting her grip on the mother wolf Nox, as she had decided to call her. Nox was fading fast, her iridescent fur losing its eerie glow, but she held on just enough to tighten her grip around Arya's shoulder, as if she understood the urgency. The Dauntless loomed ahead, a beacon of hope against the encroaching storm. Arya's ship was her sanctuary, her fortress, and the closest thing she had to a home in this ruthless galaxy. As the loading ramp descended with a hiss, she stumbled inside, the cubs skittering after her. The moment the hatch sealed, she shouted into the comms. "Dauntless, full lockdown. Engines to max thrust." The ship's AI responded with a smooth, mechanical voice. "Engines warming up, Captain. Estimated departure in 60 seconds. But 60 seconds could be an eternity. As Arya placed Nox gently on the floor of the cargo bay, she caught sight of the first of the Zenter ships breaking through the cloud cover, sleek and menacing. They were on her tail, and they weren't here for negotiations. "They're not going to let us go without a fight," Arya muttered to herself, grabbing a pulse rifle from the weapons rack. Nox let out a weak growl as Arya turned to face the cargo bay door, the sound almost pleading. The cubs huddled close to their mother, their whimpers sending a pang through Arya's heart. "I'm not leaving you behind," she said softly, surprising herself with the intensity of her own conviction. "I'm going to buy us some time." The first Zenter boarding pod slammed into the Dauntless with a bone-jarring impact. Aria's ship rocked, and alarms blared. Through the narrow viewport, she saw the sleek, black hull of the alien vessel latched onto her ship like a leech. A team of Zenter soldiers was already forcing their way in. Damn it, they're not wasting any time. Aria cursed, positioning herself behind a stack of crates. She checked her pulse rifle and took a deep breath, steadying her nerves. The door to the cargo bay exploded inward, and a group of heavily armed Zenter soldiers poured in, their insectoid armor reflecting the dim lights. Aria didn't hesitate. She opened fire, the pulse rifle sending blue bolts of energy searing through the air. Two of the soldiers dropped, their armor sizzling, but the rest pressed forward, their weapons glowing ominously. Before she could be overwhelmed, a feral roar erupted behind her. Aria spun around just in time to see Nox, who had somehow dragged herself upright, her eyes blazing with renewed intensity. With a snarl that seemed to vibrate through the air, Nox leapt into the fray. Her jaws closed around the neck of one of the soldiers, her biotechnological enhancements giving her the strength to tear through their armor like paper. The Zenter soldiers hesitated, clearly unprepared for their own experiment turning against them. The cubs joined in, using their small but surprisingly sharp claws to rip into the enemy's exposed joints. Aria took advantage of their distraction, firing precise shots that dropped two more Zenter where they stood. The last soldier tried to retreat, but Nox was on him in an instant. With a final, brutal snap of her jaws, she ended the fight. The cargo bay was suddenly silent, save for the ragged breathing of the injured wolf. Aria's hands trembled as she lowered her rifle. She hadn't expected Nox to be able to fight, let alone turn the tide. As the adrenaline ebbed, she realized just how close she had come to losing everything. "You're full of surprises, aren't you?" she said, crouching down beside Nox. The wolf's glowing eyes met hers, and for a moment, there was a strange sense of understanding between them. It wasn't just a wild animal looking at her, it was something more, something almost sentient. But there was no time to ponder it further. The ship's AI chimed in. "Captain, enemy reinforcements inbound. 2 additional Zenter vessels have entered the atmosphere." Aria's heart sank. They were outnumbered, and Nox was barely standing. If they didn't leave now, they would be overwhelmed. "Dauntless, initiate hyperspace jump, now!" Aria commanded, sprinting toward the cockpit. The ship's engines roared to life, and the entire vessel shuddered as it lifted off the ground. The storm outside intensified, battering the Dauntless as it climbed into the murky sky. The Zenter ships fired volleys of plasma bolts, the blue-green energy crackling against the ship's shields. Aria gripped the controls with white knuckles, her eyes darting between the displays. The jump drive was charging, but it needed time. Too much time. As if sensing her desperation, Nox limped into the cockpit, her cubs trailing behind her. The wolf's eyes locked onto the navigation console, and Aria could feel a strange pressure building in her mind, like a whisper just beyond hearing. "What are you doing?" Aria asked, but there was no response. Instead, the lights in the cockpit flickered, and suddenly the ship's controls moved on their own. The Dauntless veered sharply, dodging an incoming plasma blast with inhuman precision. Aria could only watch in awe as Nox, her eyes glowing even brighter, somehow interfaced with the ship's systems. The ship accelerated, its thrusters burning hotter than they ever had before. Aria's sensors went wild, displaying impossible power readings. The Zenter vessels struggled to keep up, their plasma bolts missing by a hair's breadth as the Dauntless danced through the sky like a living thing. "You can control the ship?" Aria whispered, realizing with a mix of fear and wonder that Nox was using her psychic abilities to enhance the Dauntless' agility. The jump drive beeped, indicating it was ready. Aria punched the button, and with a blinding flash, the Dauntless leapt into hyperspace, leaving the storm-ridden planet and the pursuing Zenter ships behind. The moment they were clear, the ship fell into silence, save for the soft hum of the engines. Aria slumped back in her seat, her body aching with exhaustion. She turned to find Nox lying on the floor of the cockpit, her breath labored. The effort to control the ship had drained what little strength she had left. Arya knelt beside the wolf, gently running a hand through her strange, metallic fur. "Thank you," she said softly. "You saved us." Bolt, Shade, and Echo, the cubs, nuzzled close to their mother, their eyes filled with worry. Arya's heart clenched as she realized that if she didn't do something soon, Nox might not survive much longer. With a sigh, Arya stood up and headed to the ship's mid-bay. She was no expert in alien biology, but she had a few tricks up her sleeve. She had seen enough horrors in her years scavenging war-torn worlds to know how to improvise. "Hang in there, Nox," she muttered as she pulled out a collection of Zenter biopatches and healing gels she had salvaged. "I didn't come this far to lose you now." The Dauntless was a ship meant for scavenging, not saving lives. But for the first time in a long while, Arya felt something she hadn't felt in years, a flicker of hope. She wasn't alone anymore. And as she patched up Nox's wounds, Arya realized she was willing to risk everything to protect her newfound companions. The Dauntless drifted through the quiet void of hyperspace, the only sounds aboard the ship the soft hum of the engines and the occasional whimper of the cubs. Arya Lennox sat slumped in the pilot's seat, exhaustion weighing down her limbs like lead. The adrenaline rush from their daring escape had faded, leaving her with a bone-deep weariness. She glanced over her shoulder, where Nox lay stretched out on a makeshift bed in the corner of the cockpit, her breathing shallow but steady. Arya had done everything she could with the limited medical supplies she had. The biopatches and healing gels had stabilized Nox, but it was clear that the wolf was in bad shape. Arya knew she needed to find real medical care if Nox was going to survive. But where could she go? The Zenter wouldn't stop hunting them now that they knew their precious bioweapon was still alive. Arya ran her fingers through her tangled hair, her mind racing. She had once known a doctor on the edge of the Outer Rim, someone who owed her a favor. But reaching that system would take days, maybe longer. And she wasn't even sure the doctor would be willing to risk getting involved with the Zenter on her tail. Her thoughts were interrupted by a sudden, jarring noise. The ship's sensors blared an alert, red lights flashing across the control panel. Arya's heart lurched as she recognized the telltale sign of a hyperspace disturbance. "No, no, no," she muttered, slamming her fist against the console. The Dauntless shuddered violently, and with a gut-wrenching lurch, it was yanked out of hyperspace. The stars outside the viewport stretched and twisted before snapping back into sharp focus, revealing a scene that made Arya's blood run cold. 3 sleek, black Zenter warships hovered ominously before her, their weapons glowing with barely contained energy. Arya's stomach sank as her comms crackled to life, a deep, guttural voice filling the cockpit. "Attention, human vessel. This is Commander Varkesh of the Zenter Dominion. You are harboring stolen Zenter property. Surrender immediately, or be destroyed." Arya's fingers flew over the control panel, her mind racing for a way out. The Dauntless was fast, but it wasn't built for combat, and there was no way she could outgun 3 Zenter ships. Her eyes darted to Nox, who was struggling to rise, her eyes glowing faintly. "Nox, I don't know if you can hear me," Arya said, her voice a desperate whisper. "But if you've got any more of those tricks up your sleeve, now's the time." But Nox was too weak. The effort she had expended during their escape had drained her reserves, and now she could barely lift her head. Arya felt a surge of panic rise in her chest. She couldn't fight off the Zenter and protect the cubs at the same time. A sudden idea sparked in her mind, a desperate, reckless idea. She leaned over to the comms console and activated the transmission link. "Commander Varkesh, this is Captain Arya Lennox," she said, keeping her voice steady. "I'm willing to negotiate. But I want assurances that you won't harm the creatures." There was a pause, then the harsh voice of the Zenter commander crackled through the speakers. "Negotiate? You are in no position to negotiate, human. Surrender the creatures, and I might consider sparing your pathetic life." Arya's jaw clenched. The Zenter's reputation for cruelty was well known, and she had no illusions about what would happen if she handed over Nox and her cubs. But she needed time to think, to plan. She hit a few buttons on her console, subtly activating a hidden subroutine in the Dauntless systems. "All right," she said, forcing a calm she didn't feel. "I'll open the cargo bay doors. But if you want your experiment back, you'll have to board my ship to retrieve it." There was a moment of silence, and then Varkesh responded with a derisive laugh. "Very well, human. Prepare to be boarded. Any tricks, and I'll blast your ship into scrap metal." The Dauntless shuddered as a Zenter boarding pod latched onto its hull with a metallic thud. Aria's hands moved quickly, setting her plan into motion. She had no intention of surrendering Nox and the cubs, but she needed to draw the Zenter into a trap. She raced to the cargo bay, where Nox lay panting, her cubs huddled close. The wolf's glowing eyes locked onto Aria's with a mixture of exhaustion and trust. Aria knelt beside her, gently stroking Nox's metallic fur. "Listen, I need you to trust me," Aria whispered. "I'm going to draw them in here. When I give the signal, I need you to do whatever you can to help." Nox's ears flicked forward, and though she was weak, Aria saw a flicker of determination in her eyes. The cubs, sensing their mother's resolve, pressed closer, their tiny bodies trembling. The sound of metal grinding against metal echoed through the cargo bay as the boarding pod's hatch began to open. Aria ducked behind a stack of crates, her pulse rifle at the ready. She took a deep breath, steadying herself for what was to come. The first Zenter soldier stepped through the hatch, his black armor gleaming in the dim light. Aria didn't wait. She fired a burst of energy bolts, dropping him before he could react. But more were behind him, pouring into the bay like a tide of darkness. "Now, Nox!" Aria shouted. In that instant, Nox let out a deep, resonant growl that seemed to shake the very air. The lights flickered, and the ship's systems seemed to surge with raw energy. Aria felt a strange pressure in her mind again, like fingers brushing against her thoughts. The Dauntless came alive. The ship's automated defenses whirred into action, turrets descending from the ceiling and firing at the intruders. Nox, using the last of her psychic energy, seemed to be amplifying the ship's systems. The cubs, emboldened by their mother's strength, darted forward, attacking the legs of the soldiers with surprising ferocity. Aria took advantage of the chaos, weaving between the crates and firing at the Zenter soldiers. They were disoriented, unprepared for a ship that seemed to fight back on its own. With Nox's psychic link, the Dauntless moved like a living creature, sealing off sections, rerouting power, and even venting atmosphere to throw off the boarding party. The Zenter commander, Varkesh, finally stormed into the bay, his eyes blazing with fury. He raised a massive, serrated weapon, aiming directly at Nox. Aria's blood ran cold. "No," she screamed, leaping forward and firing her pulse rifle. The shot hit Varkesh in the shoulder, causing him to stagger. But before he could recover, Nox lunged with the last of her strength, her jaws closing around his arm. There was a sickening crunch, and Varkesh screamed in pain. Aria didn't hesitate. She fired again, this time hitting him square in the chest. The Zenter commander crumpled to the floor, his weapon clattering beside him. The remaining Zenter soldiers hesitated, their morale shattered. Aria hit a button on her wrist console, releasing an electromagnetic pulse she had rigged earlier. The pulse surged through the ship, disabling the soldiers' armor and weapons, leaving them vulnerable. "Get off my ship!" Aria shouted, firing another burst that sent the surviving Zenter scrambling back into their pod. She hit the release button, and with a deafening roar, the boarding pod detached, drifting aimlessly into space. The Dauntless was eerily quiet as Aria slumped to the floor, her chest heaving. Nox lay beside her, her breath shallow but steady. The cubs curled up against their mother, their eyes glowing softly in the dim light. Aria reached out, gently stroking Nox's fur. "You did good," she whispered. "We're not out of the woods yet, but we've got a fighting chance." Nox let out a soft, grateful whine, her eyes closing. Aria's gaze turned to the stars outside, her mind already racing with plans. She needed to find a safe place to hide, to rest, and to figure out what the Zenters truly wanted with Nox and her cubs. Because now, more than ever, she was determined to protect them. The Dauntless drifted in the quiet solitude of deep space, far from the usual trade routes and patrolled sectors. The battered ship was a sanctuary now, hidden away in an uncharted star system where the Zenter wouldn't find them, at least not immediately. The stars outside the viewport twinkled serenely, a stark contrast to the chaos and violence that had erupted just hours ago. Captain Aria Lennox rubbed her tired eyes and took a deep breath, trying to steady her nerves. The events of the last battle replayed in her mind Nox's psychic connection with the ship, the ruthless determination of the Zenter soldiers, and the haunting moment when the mother wolf had nearly given her life to protect her cubs. Aria's gaze drifted to the mid-bay, where Nox lay motionless on a padded table. The biopatches and gel she'd applied were keeping the wolf alive, but barely. The cubs Bolt, Shade, and Echo huddled close to their mother, their eyes dimmed with fear and exhaustion. They had been through too much, and so had Aria. "I need to do more," Aria whispered to herself, her voice barely audible in the stillness of the ship. The Dauntless AI chimed in, breaking her thoughts. "Captain, you have an incoming encrypted message from the Outer Rim. It's marked as urgent." Aria's heart skipped a beat. She hadn't expected a response so quickly. She rushed to the cockpit and activated the comms panel. The holographic display flickered to life, revealing a grizzled old man with a prosthetic eye and a grumpy expression. Dr. Elias Richter. "Aria, what kind of trouble have you gotten yourself into this time?" Richter growled, though there was a hint of concern in his voice. "I need your help, Doc," Aria replied, wasting no time on pleasantries. "I've got a wounded. Well, it's not exactly human. I think it's a Zenter bioweapon, but it's different. There are cubs, and they're intelligent." Richter's brows furrowed as he listened. "Zenter bioweapons? You've got some nerve asking me to risk my neck for that. You know what they'll do if they find out." "I know the risks, but I don't have anyone else to turn to," Aria pleaded. "Nox the mother she saved my life. They're not just weapons, they're alive, and they're desperate. Please, Elias." Richter rubbed his temple, groaning in exasperation. "Fine. But if I do this, we're going off the grid. No one can know about this. You'll have to lose any tracking signals. I've got a secure lab on the dark side of Vespera 9. Get here fast." The transmission cut off, leaving Aria with a flicker of hope. Vespera 9 was a small, ice-covered moon deep in the Outer Rim, far from the Zenters' usual patrol routes. But getting there meant traversing treacherous space, where they were likely to run into pirates, mercenaries, or worse, more Zenter. "Dauntless, plot a course for Vespera 9, Aria commanded. "And engage stealth protocols. We can't afford to be tracked." "Course plotted, Captain," the AI responded smoothly. "Estimated time of arrival, 72 hours. As the Dauntless hurtled through the void, Aria took a moment to rest. She leaned against the cool metal wall of the mid-bay, watching Nox's labored breathing. The cubs were curled up against their mother, their soft whimpers breaking the silence. Bolt, the bravest of the cubs, lifted his head and stared at Aria, his glowing blue eyes filled with an almost human curiosity. "Hey, little one," Aria whispered, reaching out a hand. Bolt cautiously nuzzled her palm, his fur soft and warm. Shade and Echo joined in, their tiny bodies pressing close for comfort. Aria's heart ached. She had never been one for attachments, but these creatures had wormed their way into her soul. "I promise, I won't let them hurt you," she said softly, though the words felt like a fragile vow. Suddenly, the ship's alarms blared to life, snapping Aria out of her reverie. "Captain, unidentified vessels on an intercept course," the AI reported. "They've detected us." Aria's blood ran cold. How had they been found? She rushed to the cockpit, her fingers flying over the controls. The radar display showed 3 blips closing in fast Zenter ships, no doubt. They had found her again, and this time, they wouldn't let her escape so easily. Damn it! How did they track us? Arya muttered, frantically calculating their options. The stealth protocols should have hidden them. But then it hit her there was only one explanation, a hidden tracker on the Dauntless. They must have planted it during the earlier skirmish. With no time to search for the tracker, Arya made a snap decision. We're going to have to jump again. Dauntless, override safety protocols and charge the hyperspace drive to maximum output. Warning, such a jump will put extreme stress on the drive core, the AI warned. Do it! Arya snapped. She didn't have a choice. The Dauntless shuddered violently as the engines roared to life, pushing the ship to its limits. The stars outside blurred as they jumped to hyperspace, but Arya knew it was only a temporary reprieve. The Zenter were relentless. They would keep coming until they had Nox and the Cubs back in their grasp. After what felt like an eternity, the ship emerged from hyperspace, coasting into the shadow of Vespera 9. The ice moon loomed ahead, its surface reflecting the faint light of a distant sun. Arya let out a breath she didn't realize she was holding. We made it, she whispered. The Dauntless navigated through the dense asteroid field surrounding Vespera 9, finally reaching a hidden cave entrance that led to Richter's underground lab. Arya set the ship down gently, the engines sighing in relief as they powered down. As the ramp descended, Richter was already waiting, surrounded by an assortment of medical equipment and scanning devices. Let's see what kind of mess you've brought me this time, he muttered, his gruff demeanor masking his genuine concern. Arya and Richter worked quickly, transferring Nox to a sterile examination table. The old doctor's eyes widened as he scanned the wolf and her cubs. Incredible. Their biology is unlike anything I've ever seen. It's not just technology, it's something more. Can you save her? Arya asked, her voice tense. Richter's expression softened. I'll do my best. But it'll take time. And if the Zenter find out where we are? Arya nodded. She knew the risks. I'll handle that. Just focus on saving her. As Richter began his work, Arya turned to the entrance, her pulse rifle slung over her shoulder. The Dauntless would need repairs, and she would need to set up defenses in case the Zenter came knocking. She glanced back at Nox, who lay still but breathing easier now. Hang in there, she whispered. We're not done fighting yet. The Cubs watched her with those bright, knowing eyes, as if they understood what was at stake. For the first time in a long while, Arya felt a surge of hope. They had made it this far together, and she wasn't about to give up now. Arya stepped out into the cold, dark expanse of Vespera 9, her breath misting in the freezing air. The war wasn't over, but for now, they had a moment to regroup, to heal. And Arya would make damn sure that no one Zenter or otherwise would ever take that away from them again. The end. Or perhaps, the beginning of a new journey.